On the morning of December 7, 1941, one American officer at Pearl Harbor had exactly one job: to know what the Japanese were going to do before they did it. He didn't know. 2,400 Americans died that morning. Nobody signed an order against him. Nobody had to. He wrote his own way out, a transfer request filed that same afternoon, because in the United States Navy, when a commander is relieved, his staff goes with him. That was the tradition, and Edwin Layton understood it better than anyone. Then an admiral from Texas landed at Pearl Harbor in civilian clothes, on the direct order of the President of the United States. And he did something Washington was not expecting. He kept him. 5 months later, that same officer sat down in front of a chart and said 3 numbers out loud: a bearing, a distance, a time. The last 3 aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet went to sea on those 3 numbers. June 4, 1942, 5:34 in the morning. In a plotting room above Pearl Harbor, a man in khaki stands over a chart of the Central Pacific. He is not moving. Around him, teleprinters clatter. Officers lean across the table with dividers and grease pencils. Somewhere out beyond the curve of the ocean, those 3 carriers are turning into the wind. The man is looking at a single pencil mark. He put it there days ago, and he has not slept properly since, because if that mark is wrong, the United States has lost the Pacific Ocean, and he is the reason. The first contact report is coming in over the wire right now. Hold that image, because to understand what it cost him, you have to go back to a harbor still burning, and to a morning when this same man walked into this same building and found that every marker on his map was in the wrong place. Every single one. December 31, 1941. Just before 9 in the morning. The United States Navy needs a deck. Something flat and level and afloat, big enough to hold a change of command ceremony for the officer who will run the war against Japan. There isn't one. Arizona is on the bottom of the harbor. 1,177 of her crew died that morning, and some 900 of them are still inside her. Oklahoma has rolled onto her side like an animal that lay down and did not get up. West Virginia, California, Nevada, sunk, beached, gutted by fire. 3 weeks ago this was a battle line. This morning it is a salvage problem. So they use a submarine. The USS Grayling sits low against the dock, black and narrow, riding almost flush with the water. The officers who come aboard are in dress whites. The sky above them is gray. The oil is still on the harbor, sliding between the pilings with the tide, catching what little light there is and turning it dark. They stand on the deck of a submarine because the Pacific Fleet has nothing better to stand on. And among them is a 38-year-old lieutenant commander who has already decided his career is finished. His name is Edwin Thomas Layton. Now here is the thing most versions of this story get wrong. No one had fired him. There was no order. There was no letter. There was no board of inquiry with his name on the docket. Nobody in Washington had written the words "Relieve Layton" on a piece of paper. He wrote the request himself. Because he understood the tradition, and the tradition did not need to be explained to him. In the United States Navy, when a commander is relieved, his staff goes with him. That is how it works. That is the honor of the thing. Admiral Husband Kimmel had been relieved on the 17th of December. Every officer who had served him understood what came next. So Layton did not argue. He did not write letters defending himself. He did not go looking for someone else to blame, and by his own account he never seriously considered it. He asked for a destroyer. That is what a man asks for when he wants to stay useful and get out of the way at the same time. A ship. Salt water. A job where the enemy is something you can see. The request was sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting for an answer, on the morning he stood on that submarine deck in his whites. His title was Fleet Intelligence Officer, United States Pacific Fleet. He was the first man to hold that job as a full-time assignment rather than an additional duty. For a year, from December of 1940 until that Sunday morning, his entire professional purpose had been to know what the Japanese Navy was going to do before it did it. And he had gotten there by a road almost no one else in the Navy had walked. 1929. A steamer crossing the Pacific. The Navy ran a small program in those years that hardly anyone outside the service knew about. Every year it selected a handful of junior officers and sent them to Japan. Not to steal documents. Not to run agents. To live there. To learn the language from the inside. To spend 3 years finding out how the other side thought, what they read, what they argued about, how they carried themselves in a room. They were not looking for the top of the class. They were looking for a particular kind of mind. Patient, Observant. Quiet in the right way. In 1929, one of the officers they chose was Edwin Layton, 26 years old, Naval Academy class of 1924. And on that crossing he met another man headed to the same city for the same reason. Joseph John Rochefort, 29 years old. Thin, restless, and quiet in an entirely different register. Layton was easy in company, the kind of man who could make himself at home anywhere, ask a question that sounded like small talk and remember the answer for 20 years. Rochefort was not easy anywhere. Codes had gotten inside his head long before the Navy pointed him at Japan. He forgot to eat. He forgot what day it was. Strangers thought he wasn't listening. He was always listening. They became friends on that ship. It would matter more than either of them could have imagined. Layton went to Tokyo and did the work. Kabuki theater, sitting through hours of a language he was learning one word at a time. Morning newspapers with a dictionary open beside him. Formal dinners with Japanese naval officers, receptions, official functions. Listening not for secrets but for texture. The way these men spoke about the sea. The way they spoke about Americans. The things they would not admit to each other. He came home in 1932 with something that could not be written into a report. Rochefort went into cryptanalysis. Layton went into intelligence. 2 paths out of the same 3 years. Then, in 1937, Layton went back, this time as assistant naval attaché at the American Embassy. And Japan had changed. In 1929 there had still been an argument inside that country about its future. By 1937 the argument was settled. The war in China was underway. The officers at official functions carried themselves like men who had already decided, and were waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Some voices still counseled restraint. They spoke quietly now and only where they trusted the room. One of them belonged to the Vice Minister of the Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto. Autumn of 1938. A formal duck netting party at Hama-Rikyu, a detached imperial garden south of the palace grounds. Naval officers, Japanese and a small number of foreign attaches. Layton was among them. He watched Yamamoto. Not for information. Yamamoto gave away nothing he did not intend to give away. Layton watched how the man argued, where he pushed, where he stopped, where he recalculated in the middle of a sentence. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had walked through American factories and seen the production lines with his own eyes, and he understood what those factories meant in a way that a great many of his colleagues had chosen not to understand. He had said, in rooms where he trusted the audience, that a long war with the United States was not a war Japan could win. He would design the attack on Pearl Harbor anyway. Layton left Tokyo for the last time in 1939 knowing something no report could carry. Which brings us to why the map was wrong. Late November 1941, Layton told Kimmel that war was coming. Not eventually, not possibly, but within days or weeks. He had the indicators. Japanese consulates burning their codes. Fleet units leaving home ports. The whole posture of a country leaning forward. Where would they strike? The Philippines. Malaya. The Dutch East Indies. Probably all of it at once. He did not say Pearl Harbor. And here is the uncomfortable truth underneath that. He was not lazy. He was not careless. He was reading the best material available to any analyst on Earth, and the entire method depended on one condition. The enemy had to be transmitting. On November 26, 6 Japanese fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo left Haito-Kapu Bay in the Kuril Islands and steered east across the northern Pacific. Not reduced signals. Not careful signals. Silence. 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and their escorts crossed 2,000 miles of ocean without a single transmission. To every listening station the United States possessed, that force did not exist. On December 2, Kimmel asked him directly where the Japanese carriers were. Layton looked at his chart. The markers had not moved in days because there had been nothing to move them with. By his own later account, Kimmel asked whether they might be rounding Diamond Head without his knowing it. Layton said he hoped they would be sighted before that. December 7, 7:55 in the morning. He was at home when the first explosion rolled up from the harbor. He drove to headquarters through streets where men in white were running toward the water. He walked into the operations room. The map was still on the table, the same map he had updated every morning for a year. Every marker for the Japanese carrier force was wrong. Nobody shouted at him. Nobody had to. And Layton sat down and did the only useful thing left. He began building the picture of what had just happened. The size of the strike, the bearings, what they had hit, and what, strangely, they had not touched. The tank farm above the harbor, 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, untouched. The submarine base, untouched. The repair yards and the dry docks, untouched. And the carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, all of them somewhere else. He wrote none of it down as an excuse. That afternoon he submitted his transfer request. Christmas morning, 1941. A 4-engine Coronado flying boat came down out of the low cloud over East Loch and settled onto the water. The man who stepped out of it was wearing civilian clothes. That was deliberate, and it came from the top. No uniform at the train station. No photograph for the papers. Come in quietly. Look at what actually happened. Then decide. An admiral's barge pulled alongside. He stepped down into it. The rain was steady. The oil was still on the water. The masts of the Oklahoma stood up at an angle no shipyard had ever designed. He said very little for a long time. Chester William Nimitz, 56 years old. Tall, pale-eyed, unhurried, out of the Texas Hill Country. He spent the next 6 days walking the damage, reading the reports, sitting through briefings, listening far more than he spoke. And on the 31st, on the deck of a submarine, he took command. Then he called his staff together. They came in expecting the axe. These were Kimmel's officers, the men who had watched the fleet die and spent 3 weeks waiting to find out what it would cost them. Some of them had already quietly hoped for sea duty, for anywhere that wasn't this harbor. Nimitz was seated when they filed in. He looked at them for a moment. He told them he knew most of them already. He told them they had taken, in his words, a whale of a wallop, but that he had no doubt about how the war would end. Then he told them the 7th of December would not be held against them. Nobody was going. They were needed. They were staying. One officer in that room said afterwards that in a very few minutes of quiet speech, Nimitz had convinced every man present that he could lead them out of it. Layton stood there and heard it with the rest of them. He went back to his desk. He withdrew the transfer request. And within days, Nimitz would call him in alone, and hand him an assignment that no admiral in the history of the United States Navy had ever given to an intelligence officer. Sometime in the first days of January 1942, Chester Nimitz called Edwin Layton into his office and closed the door. By Layton's own account, and this is his telling written down 4 decades later, so hold it the way you'd hold any old man's memory of the best day of his life, Nimitz did not mention the 7th of December. He did not offer absolution. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not want the intelligence officer's version of what had gone wrong, because the wreckage of it was still visible from the window. What he wanted was something else entirely. He told Layton to become the enemy, not to track the enemy, not to count his ships and plot his last known position and file a report, to sit inside Nagumo's head, to see the war the way Nagumo saw it, the aims, the fears, the assumptions, to come in every morning and say what the Japanese were going to do and why, and when, as though Layton himself were the man giving the orders. Then tell him. Before it happened. There is no other assignment quite like it in the records of the United States Navy. Intelligence officers reported facts. Nimitz was asking a man to report a mind. And there was only one officer in the Pacific Fleet who could even attempt it. The man who had spent 3 years in Tokyo learning the language one kabuki performance at a time. The man who had stood in a garden at Hama-Rikyu in the autumn of 1938 and watched Isoroku Yamamoto argue. The man who had gotten it catastrophically wrong on a Sunday morning and would carry that particular weight in his chest for the rest of his life. From that day, Layton had something almost nobody in the Pacific Fleet had. He could walk into the Admiral's office at any hour, day or night, without an appointment, without knocking. If he had something, Nimitz wanted it immediately. He would need every bit of that access. Because the 5 months that followed were not a recovery. They were a hemorrhage. Think about what the men listening to the radio in American kitchens heard in the winter and spring of 1942. Not one defeat. A season of them. February 15th. Singapore. The fortress that could not fall fell, and something on the order of 80,000 British, Australian and Indian troops walked into captivity, the largest surrender in the history of the British Empire. Whole regiments filing out of their positions with their hands in the air. February 27th. The Battle of the Java Sea. A scratch force of American, British, Dutch and Australian ships went into the dark against a Japanese covering force and was taken apart. The Dutch Admiral, Karel Doorman, went down with his flagship. The The very next night the American cruiser Houston and the Australian cruiser Perth were cornered in Sunda Strait and sunk fighting. The men who survived Houston went into Japanese prison camps and onto the Burma Railway, and most of America would not learn what had happened to them for years. The Dutch East Indies came apart island by island. Rubber. Ports. Gone. April 9th. Bataan. Some 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers, starving, riddled with malaria, surrendered on a peninsula in the Philippines. What came next got a name that men of a certain generation never had to be reminded of. The March. May 6th. Corregidor. The last flag in the Philippines came down. Every morning through all of it at 15 minutes past 8, in a building on a hill above a harbor that still smelled of fuel oil, Edwin Layton walked into Chester Nimitz's office and briefed his admiral on an enemy who had not lost anything yet. And Nimitz did the only thing he could do, which was to look busy. He sent his 3 carriers out. The Marshalls, Gilberts, Wake Island, Marcus. Small raids, thin results, real risk. Militarily they changed very little. That was not the point. The point was that somewhere in Tokyo, in the operations section of Imperial General Headquarters, men were counting American ships and drawing conclusions about how much fleet the United States had left. Nimitz needed that count to stay honest. He needed the Japanese to believe there was still a Pacific fleet out there because on the day they stopped believing it they could go anywhere they wanted. He was bluffing with 3 carriers and a stack of estimates. And the estimates came from a basement. Down beneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters building, behind a steel door that required a badge nobody outside a very short list possessed, was a windowless room in a converted basement. The men who worked there called it the dungeon. It was cold because the IBM punch card machines needed to be cold, and what the machines needed, the machines got. They ran day and night and the noise of them got into your teeth. Paper covered every flat surface. Intercept sheets, worksheets, index cards, columns of Japanese 5-digit code groups written out by hand, coffee cups going cold on top of all of it. The officer in charge was Commander Joseph Rochefort, 41 years old. The same thin, restless man from the ship Crossing in 1929. He had stopped going home. He worked in a red smoking jacket over his uniform, and in carpet slippers because he was on his feet for 20 hours at a stretch and shoes hurt. He forgot meals. He forgot what day of the week it was. His men worked 12-hour shifts and then stayed on for 6 more, because Rochefort was still at his desk and nobody wanted to be the man who left first. Now here is where most tellings of this story go soft, and where the truth is actually better. Joseph Rochefort did not break the Japanese naval code. Nobody did. Not one man, not in one room, not in one basement in Hawaii. The code was JN-25B, the Imperial Japanese Navy's main operational cipher, and breaking into it was not a moment. It was an industry. It ran across 3 continents. Station HYPO in Hawaii under Rochefort. Station Cast, which had begun the war in a tunnel on Corregidor and was evacuated by submarine as the Philippines collapsed. Men and equipment carried out in the dark, reassembled in Australia as the Fleet Radio Unit, Melbourne. British cryptanalysts driven out of Singapore, regrouping across the Indian Ocean. OP-20G in Washington. All of them feeding the same enormous, tedious, unglamorous machine: traffic analysis, direction finding, code group recovery, additive stripping, the slow accumulation of guesses that hardened into probabilities. And even at its best, in the spring of 1942, they were reading a fraction of it. Not most. A fraction. A message might come out with a verb and a date and a geographic designator, and 3 holes in it where the important part used to be. That is the thing to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. Code breaking did not produce answers. It produced odds. Every single decision Chester Nimitz made in the first half of 1942 was a bet placed on incomplete information by men who knew exactly how incomplete it was. Nobody in that basement ever handed the Admiral a certainty. They handed him a probability and then went back downstairs and waited to find out if they had just killed the United States Navy. Which brings us back, 3 months back, to a night when none of that had happened yet. March 4th, 1942. Just after 2 in the morning, air raid sirens went off across Oahu. Anti-aircraft crews stumbled to their guns. The island went black. Somewhere overhead, aircraft engines. Then bombs. They fell on the slopes of Tantalus, in the hills above Honolulu, into trees and wet ground and empty hillside. Some fell in the ocean. Nothing was hit. Windows rattled. A few craters in the dirt by morning. Militarily it was nothing. As a question it was enormous. Because there were no Japanese aircraft carriers within 1,000 miles of Hawaii. There were no Japanese airfields within range. Something had flown over the American fleet anchorage at night, dropped ordnance and gone home, and nobody in the Pacific Fleet could explain how. Nimitz wanted to know. Layton's account of what happened next is his own, and again, it is worth flagging that it comes down to us mainly through the book he wrote at the end of his life. But it is the kind of detail a man does not invent because it is so unheroic in its origins. He remembered an article. Something he had read before the war. A technical piece describing a Japanese method of refueling long-range flying boats from submarines at remote anchorages. No base required. No airstrip. Just a lagoon with enough shelter, a submarine with fuel in her tanks, and a crew willing to do it in open water. He got out the charts. He ran the fuel figures. He looked at the geography of the Central Pacific and asked one question. Where is there a piece of water, empty enough that no one is watching it, close enough that an aircraft could stage from there to Oahu and back? There was essentially one answer. French frigate shoals. About 500 miles northwest of Honolulu. A crescent of reef and sandbar and shallow lagoon in the middle of nowhere, with a single rock sticking up out of it. Nobody lived there. Nobody patrolled it. He told Nimitz. Nimitz sent ships. And then nothing happened. For weeks nothing. No contact, no engagement, no shot fired, no headline. A seaplane tender and a couple of small craft sitting in a lagoon in the middle of the Pacific, doing nothing at all, while the Philippines fell and the Japanese ran the table from Burma to the Solomons. Any staff officer looking at the resource ledger could have called it a waste. Late May 1942, a Japanese submarine came up on French frigate shoals to prepare the refueling for a second reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor. There were American ships in the lagoon. The operation was cancelled. Sit with what that means. The Japanese plan for the largest naval operation their navy had ever attempted included a final look at Pearl Harbor to confirm where the American carriers were before the fleet committed. That look never happened. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo would take 4 carriers toward Midway without a current picture of where the American carriers were. In a carrier battle, everything comes down to who finds the other man first. The side that finds first strikes first. The side that strikes first hits flight decks loaded with fueled and armed aircraft. Nagumo went in blind. That empty lagoon was not the only reason. His submarine picket line got into position late, and his own scouting on the morning of the battle was thin and slow. But it was the first reason. It happened 3 months early. And it happened because one man remembered one article. And while those ships sat in that empty lagoon doing nothing, something was taking shape underneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters building. By early May, the fragments coming out of the dungeon were starting to form a picture. Something very large was being staged. Multiple carrier divisions. Battleships. Transports carrying occupation troops, which told you the objective was not a raid but a seizure. A second, smaller force pointed north toward the Aleutians. And a 2-letter geographic designator appearing over and over in the traffic. Rochefort's people were convinced AF was Midway. The reasoning was cumulative rather than dramatic. The shape of the traffic the units addressed, the pattern of earlier designators, the strategic logic of the position. Midway sat at the outer edge of the American defensive line, close enough to Hawaii that its loss would open the door. Washington disagreed. Loudly. OP-20G, the Navy's signals intelligence organization in Washington, read the same intercepts and came to different conclusions. Some thought AF pointed at the Aleutians. Some thought the objective was the Hawaiian Islands themselves. Some thought the west coast of the United States was in play, and understand in the spring of 1942 that was not a foolish thing to worry about. Submarines had already shelled a refinery near Santa Barbara. Cities on the Pacific coast were practicing blackouts. Mothers in San Diego and Los Angeles were being told to tape their windows. If Washington was right and Nimitz stripped the Hawaiian approaches to set an ambush at Midway, he would be leaving the door open behind him. If Pearl Harbor was right and Nimitz did not move, the Japanese would take Midway unopposed, and the one chance in the war to catch the Kido Butai at a disadvantage would evaporate. 2 answers. 1 ocean. 1 fleet. And underneath the professional disagreement was something uglier, which Layton and Rochefort both understood and neither of them said out loud at the time. The dispute was not purely about intelligence. Rochefort was a problem for Washington. He was too far away, too independent, too willing to tell headquarters in writing that headquarters was wrong. He had been an enlisted man before he was an officer, and he did not have the polish that got a man ahead in a peacetime Navy. Worse, from the perspective of the men running OP-20G, in particular Captain Joseph Redman and Commander John Redman, a basement outfit in Hawaii was consistently producing better product than the headquarters organization that was supposed to be producing it. There are men who see that and think, good, we're winning. And there are men who see that and think, this reflects on me. The Redmans had opinions about how naval intelligence ought to be organized and who ought to be running it, and Joseph Rochefort did not appear anywhere on that list. So in the spring of 1942, while the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared the operation that would decide the Pacific War, the men who could see it coming were fighting a second war behind them, against their own service, over whose analysis would be believed. They needed proof. Not an argument. Proof. The idea came from Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Holmes. Everyone called him Jasper, a Naval Academy graduate who had been retired for a physical disability, spent the 30s writing fiction and teaching engineering at the University of Hawaii, and come back into uniform to work in the dungeon. He knew Midway the way you know a place you have actually been. He knew that the island had no natural fresh water. Everything the garrison drank came out of a distillation plant. Take away the water and Midway is a coral rock. Midway was instructed, by secure undersea cable, to transmit a message in plain language, no encryption at all, reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that they were short of water. It went out in the clear for anyone to hear. Then they waited. Within days, a Japanese intercept unit picked it up, encoded a report and passed it up the chain. American cryptanalysts read the report. It said in effect, AF is short of fresh water. AF was Midway. There is no cinematic moment in the sources. No cheering, no thrown papers. Men in a cold basement, exhausted, looking at a decrypt. But that piece of paper is one of the pivots of the Second World War, and it was produced by a novelist in uniform who remembered that an island in the middle of the ocean has to make its own water. Nimitz had what he needed. He began positioning to fight. But the fleet he had to fight with was not the fleet he wanted. Because of what had happened 3 weeks earlier in the Coral Sea. May 4th through 8th, 1942. The first naval battle in history in which the two fleets never saw each other. No gun duel. No smoke on the horizon. Only aircraft crossing 100 miles of empty water in both directions. The Japanese light carrier Shoho went down. The American carrier Lexington, Lady Lex, one of the great ships of the interwar Navy, took torpedoes and bombs, seemed to be saving herself, and then was torn apart by gasoline vapor explosions hours later. Her crew came off her in good order. She was scuttled by an American destroyer. And the Yorktown took a bomb through her flight deck that burst deep inside her. She came limping into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May. The yard estimate for putting her right was somewhere in the region of 90 days. Nimitz went down to look at her himself, in the dry dock, in the water, standing there in the muck while they pumped the caisson out. He gave the yard 72 hours. Not 3 months. Not 3 weeks. 3 days. What happened in that dry dock over the next 3 days belongs to men whose names never made it into any book. Welders on staging in the middle of the night. Electricians rewiring compartments that were still wet. 1,400 yard workers on her at once, the lights burning around the clock, the noise carrying across the harbor to men trying to sleep aboard other ships. Honolulu's power company cut service to parts of the city to give the yard the load it needed. She sailed on the 30th of May. She was not repaired. She was patched, shored, and pointed in the right direction. There were compartments aboard her nobody had gotten to. She went to sea anyway because 3 carriers might be enough and 2 would not be. And there was one more problem. The obvious man to command the American carriers at Midway was Vice Admiral William Halsey. 59 years old, the most aggressive flag officer in the United States Navy, the man who had run the winter raids and whose task force had launched Jimmy Doolittle's B-25s off the deck of the Hornet in April. Halsey came back to Pearl Harbor at the end of May with a severe case of dermatitis. He had lost weight. He could not sleep. The condition had gotten so bad he could barely stand to be in his own uniform. The doctors took him off the ship and put him in a hospital bed, and he did not go quietly. Nimitz asked him who should take his place. Halsey named Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance. 55 years old. commander of his cruiser screen. A surface officer his entire career. No wings, no carrier command, no experience whatsoever running a flight deck in combat. Quiet to the point of coldness. Walked for exercise. Read constantly. Never raised his voice. So the United States would fight the largest carrier battle in history with a task force commander who had never fought one, and a repaired ship held together with 3 days of welding, against the fleet that had done Pearl Harbor. On the basis of an estimate. Days before the fleet sailed, in Nimitz's office, they laid it all out on the table, the admiral, his intelligence officer, and the charts. This next part comes to us from Layton's memoir, and it is the account of one man remembering one conversation 40 years later. The demand that came back across that table was the one any careful commander would make, and the one that made Layton's stomach drop. Nobody could fight a battle on an estimate. They needed specifics. Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer. By Layton's own account, the admiral acknowledged plainly that what he was about to ask for was impossible, and then asked for it anyway. He wanted a bearing, a distance, a time. Layton looked down at the chart. Understand what he was being asked to put his name on. Everything he and Rochefort and Holmes and the men in the dungeon had built over 6 weeks. Fragments, probabilities, traffic patterns. The way Japanese operational orders were written. The knowledge of how Nagumo had come at Pearl Harbor 6 months before, from the northwest at first light, launching from just outside the maximum American search radius. And every one of those fragments had a hole in it. He gave them a number. The Japanese carriers would strike Midway on the morning of June 4th. They would come in from the northwest, on a bearing of about 325 degrees. They would be sighted roughly 175 miles out from the island. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning local time. No intelligence officer talks like that. Not then, not now. An estimate is a range hedged in every direction because the man giving it knows what happens if he is wrong. Layton did not hedge. The room was quiet. Nimitz took the number. He did not ask for a second opinion, and he did not wait for Washington to come around. He gave it to the men who would sail on it. And then the American carriers left Pearl Harbor and went out to a patch of empty ocean northeast of Midway, marked on the charts with a name that told you exactly what everyone understood about the odds. Point luck. 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Something on the order of 25,000 men went out to that patch of water. The man whose number had put them there stayed behind in a plotting room on a hill above the harbor, a week from finding out whether the last 3 aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet had been sent to the right place. Or to the wrong one. June 4, 1942. Before dawn. 200 miles northwest of Midway, a PBY Catalina flying boat is grinding along at a few thousand feet through gray half-light. She is slow. She is unarmored. Her crew has been in the air for hours, flying a search leg out into nothing, the way they have flown it every morning for a week. The pilot is Lieutenant Howard Audie. At 5:34 in the morning he breaks radio silence, which is the last thing a man in a flying boat wants to do with Japanese fighters somewhere below him, and sends 2 words. Enemy carriers. 11 minutes later a second Catalina, flown by Lieutenant William Chase, comes up on the circuit with the other half of it. Many planes heading for Midway. Then at 3 minutes past 6, Audie sends the detail. 2 carriers and battleships. Bearing 320. Distance 180 miles. 1,300 miles east in a plotting room above Pearl Harbor, the message comes off the wire and into Edwin Layton's hands. He looks at the chart. Layton had said 325 degrees. The report says 320. He had said 175 miles. The report says 180. He had said around 6 in the morning. The first sighting came at 5:34. 5 degrees. 5 miles. A handful of minutes. That is the entire margin between a prediction and the fleet of the United States. He said nothing. He did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. There were 3 American carriers out there and 4 Japanese ones, and the only thing his estimate had bought was the chance to fight. He went back to reading incoming traffic. And here is where this story earns the right to be told slowly. Because what happened over the next 5 hours was not a triumph. It was a slaughter, followed by a miracle, and the men who bought the miracle did not live to see it. The first Americans to reach the Japanese fleet did not come from the carriers at all. They came off the island, marine dive bombers flying aircraft the Navy had already written off, Army B-20SXs pressed into service as torpedo planes, and 6 brand new Avengers, a detachment from the same squadron whose main body was still sitting on the deck of the Hornet, 100 miles away waiting its turn. They attacked without cover and they were cut to pieces. Of the 6 Avengers, 1 came back. Not one of them hit anything. Then the carrier squadrons arrived. 41 Douglas TBD Devastators from 3 squadrons, Torpedo 8 off the Hornet, Torpedo 6 off the Enterprise, Torpedo 3 off the Yorktown. He lay there in the water and watched it happen. Torpedo 6 went in. 10 of its 14 aircraft were destroyed. Torpedo 3 went in. 10 of its 12 were destroyed. Of the 41 Devastators that flew off the American carriers that morning, 6 came back. Not one American torpedo hit anything. Sit with that for a moment. 41 crews flew 100 miles over open ocean in aircraft they knew were death traps, attacked the most powerful carrier force on Earth without cover, and accomplished, in the ledger sense, in the sense a staff officer would write down, nothing at all. Except that they didn't. Because to fight them, Nagumo's fighter cover came all the way down to the water. Zeros do not climb back to altitude instantly. And while those fighters were down at wavetop height finishing off the last of the torpedo planes, the sky above the Japanese fleet was empty. At about 10:15 in the morning, American Dauntless dive bombers arrived overhead. The Enterprise squadrons at nearly 20,000 feet, the Yorktown squadron somewhat lower. The Japanese did not see them until they rolled in. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. 3 carriers hit within minutes of one another. Bombs down through flight decks into hangar spaces, into fuel lines, into ordnance that had been stacked and rest-tacked as the Japanese changed their minds about what to arm their aircraft with. Not 5 minutes from launching a counterstrike, the histories that say so have been corrected by later research using Japanese records. There were no packed decks about to go. But there was fuel, and there were bombs on the hangar deck, and there were fires that could not be contained. 3 of the 4 burned that morning. The 4th, Hiryu, fought back and hurt the Americans badly. Her aircraft found the Yorktown and hit her twice, and the ship that had been patched together in 72 hours took the punishment she had been sent out to take. American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon. She went down the following morning. The Yorktown stayed afloat until the 7th, when a Japanese submarine finished her. For Japanese fleet carriers, all 4 had been at Pearl Harbor. Now, here is the part almost nobody says out loud, and it is the truest thing in the whole battle. June was 1 in May. The Kido Butai that attacked Pearl Harbor had 6 fleet carriers. Only 4 of them were at Midway. Shokaku and Zuikaku were not there. Shokaku had been badly damaged in the Coral Sea by American dive bombers, the ones flying off Lexington and Yorktown. Zuikaku came through that battle without a scratch on her hull, but her air group had been gutted. She had no pilots. Neither ship could be made ready in time. So the battle everyone calls the turning point of the Pacific War was fought 4 against 3 instead of 6 against 3, and the reason for that was a battle in the Coral Sea that the United States Navy lost on paper. Lexington sunk. Yorktown hurt. Those men did not know what they had bought. Many of them never found out. The crews who went into the water off the Lexington in May were paying for a battle in June that had not happened yet. 4 fleet carriers and a heavy cruiser on the bottom. Something over 3,000 Japanese dead, and with them the core of a naval air arm that had taken 20 years to build and would never be rebuilt. And an American intelligence officer in a plotting room in Hawaii who had not slept. Nimitz sent for Layton afterward. He did not say well done. He did not say you were right. By Layton's account, he said one thing, that the estimate had been off by about 5 degrees, 5 miles and 5 minutes, and then went back to work. Layton walked out into the corridor and stood there. He had been in this building on the morning of the 7th of December, when every marker on his map pointed at empty ocean and the harbor burned outside the window. He was standing in the same building now, on the 4th of June, when the estimate came true to the minute. The distance between those 2 mornings was not luck, and it was not genius. It was what happens to a man who understands exactly what the first morning cost, and refuses to let it have cost nothing. He went back to his desk. April 1943. 10 months after Midway, a decrypt came into Pearl Harbor from the Fleet Radio Unit, the successor organization to Rochefort's basement. It was an itinerary. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was going on an inspection tour of forward positions in the Solomons. The message gave the date, the departure time, the airfields, the aircraft type, 2 Betty bombers. The fighter escort, 6 zeros. It was, in operational terms, a schedule detailed enough to set a watch by. The question was not whether American fighters could get there. P-38 Lightnings out of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, with long-range tanks, flying at wavetop height and navigating by compass heading and elapsed time to stay off Japanese radar. It was a brutal piece of flying, but it could be done. The question was whether they should. Nimitz asked Layton. And this is the moment the whole story has been walking toward, though nobody watching it happen would have seen it that way. The question in front of them was not tactical. It was this: if you remove Yamamoto, what comes after him? Is his replacement better or worse for Japan? Because if you kill a mediocre commander and get a brilliant one, you have made a serious mistake. There was exactly one man on the staff qualified to answer it. Not because he had read the file. Because he had been in the room. The guard. Tokyo. The autumn of 1938. Layton knew what Yamamoto had said where he trusted the audience, that Japan could not win a long war against America. And he knew Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor anyway, and executed it with precision because he was a professional and he had been overruled. Layton's assessment was blunt. There was no one else in the Imperial Japanese Navy of Yamamoto's stature. No one whose judgment carried that weight, no one else who might, at the right moment, be able to argue for ending a war that could not be won. His death would leave a hole, and the men who filled it would have fewer reservations about throwing away ships and aircraft and boys on positions that could no longer be held. His recommendation was to take the shot. Understand what that is? Not a strategic paper. A man saying, "Kill the one I sat across a table from." The decision did not stop at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz sent it up. It went to Washington, and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox gave the approval. But the assessment sitting on the Secretary's desk, the reason anyone believed the vacancy was worth creating, had been written by a lieutenant commander in Hawaii who had watched the man argue at a garden party 5 years before the war. April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after Doolittle's bombers lifted off the Hornet, 18 P-38s took off from Henderson Field. One blew a tire on the strip. One could not draw fuel from its drop tank and turn back. 16 went on. They flew a dogleg out over open water, low, silent, for more than 400 miles. They arrived over the coast of Bougainville within about a minute of the intercept window. Yamamoto's aircraft was exactly where the schedule said it would be. The bomber went down into the jungle canopy. A Japanese search party reached the wreck the next day. By their account, he was still in his seat, still wearing his white gloves. The man who designed Pearl Harbor was killed by the country he had spent his career warning his own government not to fight. And the officer who signed off on it was the officer who had failed to see Pearl Harbor coming. Now, if this were a movie, it would end there. It does not, and the reason it does not is the part of this story that a lot of men listening will recognize in their own lives. Joseph Rochefort, the friend from the ship crossing in 1929, the man who ran the basement that produced the intelligence that made all of it possible, did not get a parade. Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. Washington refused. In October of 1942, 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was quietly ordered off the island, detached from the unit he had built, sent stateside. He was eventually given command of a floating dry dock in California. A floating dry dock. The man who had run the most productive code-breaking unit in the Pacific spent the middle of the war supervising ship repair on the West Coast, thousands of miles from the work he was born to do, while the war he had helped turn went on without him. He was not relieved for failure. He was relieved because he had been right when Washington was wrong, and because he had said so in writing, and because the men who ran the headquarters organization, Joseph and John Redman among them, had their own view of who ought to be receiving credit for the greatest intelligence coup in American naval history, and Rochefort was not on the list. He never got the medal in his lifetime. Not in 1942. Not in 1945. Not in the 50s. He retired quietly. He worked. He got old. He died in 1976. In 1985, the Distinguished Service Medal was finally approved. It was presented to his family the following year. That same year, 1986, President Ronald Reagan awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. His children accepted both of them for him. He had been in the ground for a decade. That is the part Edwin Layton never stopped thinking about. The war went on for 2.5 more years after Yamamoto's aircraft went into the trees. The Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And every morning at 15 minutes past 8, in an office above Pearl Harbor, an intelligence officer briefed his admiral. On September 2, 1945, Edwin Layton stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay and watched Japanese officers in formal dress step forward to sign. The man who had written a transfer request on the afternoon of December 7, 1941 was standing there when it ended. He stayed in the Navy another 14 years. Retired in 1959 as a rear admiral. Moved to the California coast and looked out at the same ocean. And then he started writing. Not to defend himself. He had made his peace with the 7th of December a long time before, in the only way that ever works, which is by doing the job better for the next 4 years than anyone had any right to expect. He wrote to put the record down. Where the intelligence had actually been in 1941. Who had held it back. He named Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner directly, the director of war plans in Washington who, in Layton's judgment, had controlled which intercepts went out to the fleet commanders and had decided the men in Hawaii did not need them. Including a message from September 1941 in which Tokyo asked its Honolulu consulate to divide the harbor into a grid and report which ships were in which square. There is only one reason to ask a question that way. Kimmel never saw it. Layton never saw it. Historians still argue about how much difference it would have made, and about how fairly Layton judged the man he named. What nobody disputes is the plain fact underneath it. The message was read in Washington and it never reached Hawaii. He wrote for Kimmel, who spent the rest of his life as the public face of an American disaster. He wrote for Rochefort, who was buried without his medal. He wrote for the men inside the Arizona. He wrote for the men trapped in the overturned hull of the Oklahoma, who tapped on the steel for days until the tapping stopped. He wrote for years. He died on the 12th of April, 1984, 5 days after his 81st birthday. The manuscript was not finished. His widow and his 2 co-authors finished it. It came out in 1985. 4 words on the cover. Not, I was right. Not, I was wronged. And I was there. He never held a copy. If your father served in the Pacific, if your uncle came home in 1945 and didn't talk about it, if there is a photograph in your house of a young man in a uniform he never put on again, there is a real chance that some part of what let him come home was decided in a room he never entered. By a man in a basement in a smoking jacket and slippers, who got his medal 10 years after he was buried. By an intelligence officer who failed on a Sunday morning and spent the rest of his life making sure that failure was worth something. By a Texan who arrived in the rain in civilian clothes, looked at the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy, and decided the men who had lived through it were the men who understood the enemy best. Their names were never in the headline. The headline is always the battle. They were in the room where the battle was decided before it started. If you had a father, a grandfather, an uncle who served out there, leave his name below. Where he served. What ship. What island. One line is enough. That's how we keep them here one more day.